Now, I know what you're saying to yourself. Luke, you handsome and knowledgeable buffoon, what are you talking about? TNA is still in business. And you're right, it is. And isn't that actually quite stunning? Pretty much since the company's start, commentators and pundits have predicted TNA's downfall. It'll only be around for 2 years, they'd say. There's no way they'll be around in another year's time, others would add. Even when the company started to make waves and got a big TV deal, there was still a lot of talk about how TNA would be dead pretty much very soon. It became a meme among wrestling fans. After the nuclear war, the only things to survive will be cockroaches, Twinkies, and TNA wrestling. They even promoted a pay-per-view called Hard to Kill because no matter what happened, no one could kill TNA. But some came close. TNA was born from the ashes of WCW but learned none of the lessons as to why the latter fell. Vince Russo was a head booker. Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff attempted to relive their glory days. Top stars who previously couldn't compete against WWE were put on top again to compete against WWE at the expense of younger, more exciting talent. And the reality is, while still around, TNA is nowhere near the levels of popularity it had 15 or so years ago. It's on the up given its partnership with NXT, which has given the TNA letters more relevance than they've had in well over a decade, but let's also take some perspective. TNA Bound for Glory 2010 did around 25,000 pay-per-view buys. Bound for Glory 2024, even with the NXT connection, did around 5,000 pay-per-view buys. By comparison, AEW's 2024 Wrestle Dream did over 100,000 buys. TNA may still be around and it may still be popular, but it's far from the number 2 wrestling promotion, which it was once upon a time. So, what happened? How did a company whose name was once chanted at WWE shows as a sign of rebellion against Vince McMahon's monopoly become a punchline among the wrestling community? This video isn't designed or written to be a knock against anyone in TNA or the people who work there currently. You'll find no bigger mark for mid-2000s TNA than this guy sat right here, but more to pose the question: who really killed TNA's momentum from being popular once upon a time 15 years ago? Following the closure of WCW in 2001, wrestling fans were staring down the barrel of a world where only one major wrestling company reigned supreme. Not only did this mean that all wrestling would now look like how Vince McMahon wanted it to look, it also meant that some guys and girls on Vince's naughty list would struggle to find well-paid work. And there was a portion of fans who did want an alternative to what the WWF was presenting. When Jerry Saggs and Jimmy Hart, along with investment from Willie Nelson, launched the XWF in 2001, it had one mission statement: be an alternative for the fans. Around that same time, towards the end of WWF's Invasion storyline, another promotion was born called World Wrestling All-Stars, which featured a lineup of wrestlers that would become mainstays of what would become early days TNA. Old guard of the Attitude Era and new faces of the fledgling indie scene. Road Dogg, AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, Scott Steiner, Sting, Chris Sabin, Sharkboy, Loki, Frankie Kazarian, Jerry Lynn, and of course, Jeff Jarrett. Not only that, but on commentary and the company's head booker was Jeremy Borash, who had become an integral part of TNA's foundations. WWA ran a few shows in the US and across Europe, but didn't quite catch fire as many had hoped, and only ran 4 pay-per-views over 25 months. WWA is so much canonically part of TNA's early days that their titles were unified with TNA's belt at their final show in 2003. Jarrett was someone who was never going to find work with Vince McMahon following the purchase of WCW. Due to a bad passing in 1999, Vince fired Jarrett publicly on TV. Looking to start an alternative of his own, Jarrett partnered with his father Jerry Jarrett and wrestling journalist Bob Ryder and affiliated themselves with what was left of the NWA to form Total Nonstop Action, or NWA TNA. TNA launched on June 19, 2002, with a unique model. Promotions like the WWA or XWF all tried to get TV deals off the bat by taping a bunch of matches or shows and shopping them around to networks as a package deal. It meant that the shows never really gained much momentum because the companies ran their shows so sporadically. TNA's model was instead to run weekly pay-per-views, which acted as their weekly TV product. While that sounds pricey for the consumer, it was actually cheaper to buy weekly TNA pay-per-views than it was WWE's monthly pay-per-views. Rather than tour the country or attempt to conquer Europe, TNA ran all of their shows from the same location, the Tennessee State Fairground Arena, redubbed the TNA Asylum. This was not only cost-effective, it meant they grew a strong and loyal fan base. But that wasn't their only difference. Rather than copy what WWE was doing, TNA attempted to be a true alternative for wrestling fans who switched off after the purchase of WCW. To that end, they put a lot of focus on their X Division, what might have been known as the Cruiserweight Division elsewhere. But the X Division wasn't about weight limits, it was about no limits. Matches like Ultimate X were breathtaking in the early 2000s as TNA put a spotlight on this new and innovative indie style that was being ignored by WWE. This style of wrestling would become the blueprint of what both WWE and AEW put on their weekly shows to this day. While WWE would ignore tag team wrestling, TNA put a spotlight on their tag division, using the division to raise the stocks of guys like Chris Harris and James Storm. However, even with these bold new strategies, there were problems from the outset. Jerry Jarrett had one request of TNA: don't hire all the guys who killed WCW and give them creative power. And just 1 month into their run, Jeff Jarrett did just that, hiring Vince Russo, the man credited for much of WCW's darker days, to be TNA's head of creative. Russo himself claims that he came up with the initials TNA because it would sound like T and A, the initialism for tits and ass. Russo brought with him his usual Vince Russo ideas. He booked the Shane twins to be the Johnsons, who wore nude-colored bodysuits so they looked like dicks, and another team to be the Dups, one of which was called Stand Up, and they won something called the Dup Cup. How does one win the Dup Cup, you ask? Well, you get points for doing things such as putting people's heads in toilets, goosing a woman's behind, or using a farmyard animal as a weapon. You also lost points by crying. They sadly lost the Dup Cup to Tio the Hardcore Midget. Puppet the Psycho Dwarf did an angle where he masturbated in a trash can next to backstage interviewer Goldilocks. My search history is now ruined as I had to Google TNA masturbating in a trash can to get the facts of that sentence correct. Dusty Rhodes was also there. Russo tried to turn Ricky the Dragon Steamboat heel. He tried to turn Tony Schiavone heel. He booked the idea of a reverse ladder match and, famously, the Reverse Battle Royal. He was the leader of a faction called Sports Entertainment Extreme, SEX. In 2003, he booked the Hard 10 tournament, in which wrestlers got points by using weapons. Each weapon had a specific numerical value, but you also had to be ahead by a certain amount of points in order to win a match. The Sandman won, beating New Jack in the final, but the tournament was never done again, as fans complained that the point system was too complicated. Not all of this can just be credited to Russo. He himself has claimed that he never wrote an episode of TNA all alone. The first episode of TNA, for example, which he was not a part of, opens with the entrance of the main event battle royal to crown a new NWA World Champion individually come out and say that a main event battle royal to crown a new NWA World Champion was a stupid idea. Pro Wrestling Torch reported in late 2002 that there was a power struggle between Russo and Jerry Jarrett, with the latter feeling that Russo's vision of the company wasn't very good. Jeff Jarrett sided with Vince Russo, and Jerry Jarrett would leave TNA in 2005, citing disagreements with the creative vision for the company. He told Slam Wrestling in 2008 when asked what he thought of TNA, "This question is kind of like asking a parent if they still love their child in spite of it being so ugly." Fun fact, when Jerry Jarrett left TNA, he took with him what he felt was the hottest prospect in wrestling, the future of the industry, and took him straight to Vince McMahon's WWE. That man was none other than Vladimir Kozlov. In spite of what ugliness Jerry Jarrett saw, TNA did manage to attract an audience. Its blend of nostalgic acts of the Attitude Era and the fantastic X Division action was appealing to those who didn't like what WWE was presenting. By November 2002, TNA had secured a weekly syndicated TV show called Explosion, and they found financial stability thanks to Panda Energy buying 72% of the controlling stake. Panda's founder, Bob Carter, placed his daughter Dixie Carter as the president of TNA in early 2003. Even better, by the spring of 2004, TNA secured a second weekly TV show, which they titled Impact, which aired on Fox Sports Net. By the end of 2004, TNA had ditched their weekly pay-per-view model in favor of the more traditional weekly TV show and monthly pay-per-view schedule, beginning with Victory Road 2004. It's been said that this is the start of the golden age of TNA, where the company would really start to gain momentum and fan support. And I don't think it's a coincidence this is also when Vince Russo left TNA. Though that TV deal did end in May 2005, Impact aired on its own website for a few months, the game-changing event came when they signed to air on Spike TV, who had just lost WWE Raw to the USA Network. TNA Wrestling was now going to be available to millions of homes across America. While initially a 1-hour show that aired late at night, Impact soon became a 2-hour primetime TV show. Over the next few years, names like Christian Cage quit WWE and went to TNA to seek a better opportunity. The company also signed former WWE names like Billy Gunn, the Dudley Boys, Test, and Tyson Tomko. Nostalgic names like Rhino, Kevin Nash, Booker T, Sting, and Scott Steiner all joined their ever-growing ranks, appealing to those potential fans that stopped watching after the collapse of WCW and ECW. The company also separated itself from the competition visually, most notably the six-sided ring, which gave TNA its own identity. Similarly, while WWE was closing its doors and refusing to work with anyone else, TNA worked with AAA and New Japan Pro Wrestling, giving the promotion a legitimate and global feeling, despite taping its TV and pay-per-views in front of the same 900 fans in an Orlando theme park. They even got a deal to sell action figures on sale in toy stores next to WWE action figures, again giving them an air of legitimacy. They did house shows just like WWE. They toured Europe just like WWE. In 2008, they got a video game. In 2009, years before WWE did the same thing, they launched an online subscription service to watch past pay-per-views. But it also gave a big platform to that emerging indie scene. Stars like Amazing Red, Homicide, Roderick Strong, Alex Shelley, Jay Lethal, Sanjay Dutt, Low Key, and many others. They made a huge name out of Samoa Joe, who was already a Ring of Honor darling, but became one of TNA's biggest homegrown stars. His triple threat main event of Unbreakable 2005 with AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels was not only critically acclaimed, it was TNA's first 5-star match in the Wrestling Observer. It is still talked about to this day. While Ring of Honor was arguably putting on the better product, more fans were seeing these names because of TNA. The same can be said for Nigel McGuinness, who came into TNA as Desmond Wolfe, immediately putting on multiple wrestling classics in front of more eyes than those who saw his wrestling classics in Ring of Honor. But for all the good, there was also the bad. And I don't think it's a coincidence that so much became when Vince Russo made his return to TNA in late 2006. Dixie Carter brought Russo back just as TNA got their biggest acquisition in company history, Kurt Angle. Angle's departure from WWE and joining the competition was the biggest bit of news since the collapse of WCW. Just a few months earlier, he defended the World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania, and now here he was in the six-sided ring headbutting Samoa Joe. Reports at the time were that Angle had been fired by WWE due to his various substance addictions, and Vince McMahon was afraid of having an Olympic gold medalist die on his watch. Reportedly, WWE felt that Angle was a major health risk, so let him go. To say the hiring of Kurt Angle was bold and perhaps controversial is an understatement. Angle himself, however, has said at the time and remains steadfast to this day that he quit WWE because they were not letting him be the Kurt Angle he knew he could be, which he was able to do in TNA. What's interesting is that Kurt Angle can be used as an example of TNA's creative issues. Fans can talk about the Doomsday Chamber of Blood, the electrified steel cage, the Voodoo Kin Mafia, Black Rain, Judas Messias Relic, and a whole host of other Russo-ific ideas, though Russo claims the electric steel cage was not his idea, as examples of the company's bad creative. Along with "This is awesome," the most popular chant from TNA diehard fans from the time was "Fire Russo." But those things are all subjective. Pay-per-view buy rates are actually indicative of people's thoughts on Vince Russo's storytelling. TNA would usually do around 20 to 30,000 pay-per-view buys. Bound for Glory 2006, which featured Kurt Angle as the special guest enforcer for the Sting vs. Jeff Jarrett main event, did upwards of 60,000 pay-per-view buys. Angle's first match with Samoa Joe at the following month's Genesis did even more. Okay, so wow, Kurt Angle coming in might not have moved the needle in terms of TV ratings, but it's basically doubled the pay-per-view buy rates. But with that success came greed, and not the WCW pay-per-view. Angle and Joe faced each other at Genesis 2006. 2 weeks later, they teamed together to take on LAX on Impact. The following week, they had another match on TV. Then 3 days later at Turning Point 2006, Joe and Angle had another match. It was their third match together in as many weeks. The buy rate for Turning Point 2006 was back to the usual 30,000 range. They literally halved their pay-per-view audience in just 3 weeks. This was also a period of time when WWE was not a hot product, at least in the eyes of hardcore fans. In a 2-month span, December 06 to January 07, there were 2 different WWE crowds that chanted TNA as a way to tell them they did not like what was being put in front of them. But it never converted fans to changing the channel. TNA could never capitalize on the momentum they had, and it came down to the creative. During the time that Impact was a 1-hour show, Vince Russo was reportedly under the impression it was a 2-hour show. So he would book 2 hours of TV time in a 1-hour show. This meant that the 1-hour Impact show had an additional hour's worth of content in it, so everything felt rushed. When Russo was told it was not a 2-hour show, he did not change his booking. Reportedly, Scott D'Amore blew up at Russo for being clueless, and nothing changed. As some examples of silly TNA creative ideas and business mishaps, when WWE reunited Triple H and Shawn Michaels as DX, TNA had BG James and Kip James, the former Road Dogg and Billy Gunn, rename themselves Voodoo Kin Mafia. VKM, the initials of Vincent Kennedy McMahon. They did some comedy skits where they showed up at Titan Towers and went to a WWE house show trying to recapture the magic of DX invading WCW that one time, and even challenged DX to a shoot fight for $1 million. Dixie Carter reportedly was so sure that WWE would accept the challenge, they put $1 million aside, which also came at the same time as reports that TNA were no longer paying for talent accommodation or travel. In a desperate attempt for mainstream publicity, they brought in Adam Pac-Man Jones, a disgraced NFL player who'd just been suspended by the Tennessee Titans for allegedly being involved in a shooting at a Las Vegas strip club. He was charged with 2 felony offenses related to the shooting. So because he was suspended, he decided to give pro wrestling a try. But there was a problem. TNA were told by the Titans that due to his NFL contract, Pac-Man Jones could not wrestle. So TNA announced and promoted that Pac-Man Jones would wrestle. To that end, Pac-Man Jones won the TNA Tag Team Championships with Ron Killings despite being contractually unable to take bumps. Let the record book show that to win the TNA Tag Team Championships, Pac-Man Jones pinned Sting. Speaking of minor celebrities, and TNA reportedly paid Jersey Shore star JWoww $15,000 to appear on Impact, then aired her segment directly against Jersey Shore, meaning that Jersey Shore fans who might have tuned in to see JWoww on Impact tuned in to watch her on Jersey Shore instead. And of course, there was Jenna Maraska of Survivor. Years earlier, TNA had paid Johnny Fairplay of Survivor fame $150,000 for 8 appearances, then re-signed him for another $150,000 and booked him for 0 appearances. Jenna was also reportedly paid $150,000, and this resulted in arguably the worst pro wrestling match of all time at Victory Road 2009. By the summer of 2007, Angle and Joe were set to have their 4th match on pay-per-view together, just 10 months since their first, and this time it was for the TNA World Championship, the TNA X Division Championship, the TNA Tag Team Championships, and the IWGP World Championship, and was built around a 2-week storyline where Kurt Angle was getting a divorce from his wife Karen Angle despite couples therapy from Kevin Nash. I wish I was making this up. The pay-per-view did 20 to 30,000 buys. Ollie Davis and I have been chronicling a lot of this over at patreon.com/WrestleTalk. We've reviewed all of these pay-per-views in full and watched the episodes of Impact to see just what happened to TNA's most successful rivalry. And this is factually TNA's most successful period. And the only time they ever came close to the highs of Bound for Glory in Genesis 2006 was Lockdown 2008, once again main evented by Samoa Joe versus Kurt Angle, but this time with a twist. The twist was, it was booked like pro wrestling, not a soap opera storyline. Taking inspiration from the UFC, Angle vs. Joe 5 took a much more sports-orientated approach. The TV leading into the event focused on their training with sit-down interviews, and the result was upwards of 55,000 buys, at the time their 3rd most successful pay-per-view. TNA, of course, learned nothing from this and went back to their soap opera storylines. They did have successes elsewhere. In 2007, nearly 10 full years before WWE claimed they started a women's revolution, TNA put their Knockouts division front and center. Rather than be treated as 5-minute afterthoughts, eye candy, or mere accessories for male storylines, TNA's Knockouts were presented as athletes. Gail Kim and Awesome Kong put on some of the most intense and hard-hitting matches, which contrasted sharply with WWE's divas. Characters like ODB, Angelina Love, Velvet Sky, Taylor Wilde, and Madison Rayne were then joined by former WWE alumni like Tara and Mickie James, further highlighting how little WWE was doing with its women's division. LayCool, arguably one of the only successes in WWE's women division from the time, has been accused of being little more than a clone of TNA's Beautiful People. TNA's Knockouts division was so successful that their segments on TV often outdrew their male counterparts, and there were some discussions of them getting their own wrestling TV show. It should come as no surprise that Vince Russo was not involved with the Knockouts division, and much of the credit has been given to Scott D'Amore. When Russo did get control of that division, he turned it into a soap opera division, and Eric Young became one half of the Knockouts Tag Team Champions. But really, it's harsh to put all of the blame of TNA's failures at the feet of Vince Russo. While he is an easy scapegoat, ultimately he was just the head of creative. He was not the man making all the business decisions. During Russo's success in the Attitude Era, he had the filter of Vince McMahon, someone to sign off his ideas, push back on others, and tweak some to improve. Jeff Jarrett and Dixie Carter either did not do this, or actually just thought his ideas were good. What TNA perhaps needed was new leadership if they ever wanted to truly compete with WWE on their level. And who better to do that than two of the guys who led WCW to their 86-week success against Vince McMahon. But what was it that Jerry Jarrett told Jeff not to do with TNA? Hogan coming into TNA was actually their second attempt to bring in the Hulkster. In 2003, shortly after TNA opened its doors, they shot an angle where Jeff Jarrett attacked Hogan at a press conference in Japan, which would have then built to the two colliding in TNA's first 3-hour pay-per-view for the NWA World Championship. However, sadly, Hogan's hips and knee issues prevented the match from happening, and he instead returned to WWE. Hogan left WWE in 2007 and started his own touring company across Australia with the likes of Ric Flair, Orlando Jordan, and some other Hogan buddies. In 2009, Dixie Carter announced that Hulk Hogan, along with Eric Bischoff, would be coming into TNA not only as business partners, but also in creative. Carter would say, "We wanted to send a message. Hulk Hogan coming to TNA was meant to show the world that we were serious about challenging WWE. Look, you do not need me to tell you what a seismic shift Hogan going to WCW was. I did a whole other video about it." So the idea that Hogan would do the same for TNA, even though it was some 15 years later, was not out of the realms of reality. And the other game changer for WCW against Vince McMahon was running directly against Raw on Monday night. And so that was the first thing Hogan and Bischoff did when they took over TNA. Hogan's debut episode aired on January 4th, 2010, and it was a stacked show. ODB won the Knockouts Championship, Awesome Kong and Hamada won the Knockouts Tag titles, AJ Styles retained the TNA Championship against Kurt Angle in a 22-minute main event, and the company saw the returns of Jeff Hardy, Scott Hall and Sean Waltman, along with the debuts of Ric Flair, Shannon Moore, Val Venus, Orlando Jordan, the Nasty Boys, and Bubba the Love Sponge. They teased an NWO reunion, they had a game of strip poker, they did title changes. This was a big show, and WWE clearly saw TNA going head to head with them as a threat, announcing ahead of time that the first segment of Raw would feature Bret Hart's return to WWE, not seen in the company since Survivor Series 1997, and the closing of the show would be Bret in the ring live with the man who screwed him at Survivor Series 97, Vince McMahon. And WWE were right to worry. The January 4th, 2010 edition of Impact was the most watched episode in company history. Dave Meltzer reported in the Wrestling Observer newsletter that Hogan and Spike had already had meetings about more special episodes on Monday night if the number was good, but the number way surpassed Spike's expectations. But like with Angle and Joe, the lesson that TNA didn't learn here was restraint. On March 8, 2010, rather than test the waters with more Monday specials, TNA Impact moved permanently to Monday night to run head-to-head with Monday Night Raw. The Monday Night Wars were back in a big way. 2 months later, TNA would return to Thursday night, and the Monday Night Wars came to an end. TNA did come out swinging when it went head-to-head though. More new debuts came in the form of Rob Van Dam and Mr. Anderson, the former Mr. Kennedy in WWE, and the March 8th edition featured Ric Flair's first televised wrestling match since his retirement at WrestleMania 24, and Hogan's first televised match since he faced Randy Orton in 2006. It was TNA's lowest rated show of the year, but only for 1 week, as the following week was a new low, followed by another. They went from 1.4 million viewers on March 8th to 739,000 viewers on May 3rd. Spike did their best to spin the numbers for the first few weeks, but the writing was on the wall. TNA told talent that, based on feedback, TNA fans wanted Impact back on Thursdays, and technically that could be true, as the Thursday replay of the Monday show drew more viewers. Yeah, the replay outdrew the live airing. Brian Alvarez wrote in the Figure 4 on March 9th, 2010, the story of TNA is the story of a group of people who never learn a thing. They never learn a thing from their failures, and more astoundingly, they never learn a thing from their few successes. They're run by a woman who has no idea what she's doing, and the TV has been written for years by a guy who has no idea what he's doing. It's the classic story of doing the same thing over and over and over again, and hoping that somehow things will change. In fairness, the Hogan-Bischoff era did try new things. They got rid of the six-sided ring, one of the few things that separated them from WWE, and they tried to move away from the TNA name in favor of Impact Wrestling, and always relied on nostalgic acts from the past rather than focus on their homegrown stars. Desmond Wolfe, once a hot prospect in TNA, was pushed aside for Mr. Anderson, Ric Flair, Jeff Hardy, and Rob Van Dam. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall won the TNA Tag Team Championships over Matt Morgan and Hernandez. Bischoff wanted to move away from the in-ring wrestling and focus more on the scripted drama. Mike Tenay, the longtime voice of TNA, would later say the essence of what made TNA special was getting lost. The wrestling was taking a back seat, and it felt like we were losing our identity. Speaking of Desmond Wolfe, fans were telling TNA that he was a guy that they wanted to see get pushed. Quite literally. Bischoff and Hogan announced a new ranking system in their first few weeks in TNA, where fans would vote on who they would like to see get future title matches. Desmond Wolfe handily won the poll 2 weeks in a row. The problem, by all accounts though, was that Eric Bischoff did not want to push Desmond Wolfe. So Desmond Wolfe was booked to lose matches in only a couple of minutes in a figurative middle finger to the fans that Bischoff reportedly was mad at for rigging his poll. The ranking system was then quietly dropped because fans were not playing the game that Bischoff wanted to play. And then in October 2010, just 10 months after joining TNA, Hulk Hogan did a Bash at the Beach 1996 and turned heel with Eric Bischoff to form the heel stable Immortal. And in the process, did their own WrestleMania X7 by turning Jeff Hardy, just 1 year removed from being arguably WWE's most popular babyface, into a bad guy. It was a bold strategy and one that did not pay off. Not only did it harm their ticket sales, Hardy was one of the few legitimate draws they had, there were real-life issues that brought this experiment to an abrupt end. Just 2 months after Hardy won the title and turned heel, he showed up to the Final Resolution pay-per-view in no condition to perform. It was reported that TNA put in a conditional plan to strip him of the title and put Mr. Anderson in Hardy's place in the main event, but they went ahead and let Hardy perform. And then, 3 months later, Jeff Hardy had to be shoot-pinned by Sting at Victory Road 2011 in under 90 seconds. By all accounts, Hardy was fine during the day of Victory Road 2011, but by the time the main event rolled around, he was in no condition to perform. He stumbled to the ring as referee Brian Hebner threw up the X to let the back know that something was wrong. Eric Bischoff came to the ring, spoke with Jeff, spoke with Sting, and spoke with the referee to call an audible and change the finish of the match. Hardy would then spend the next minutes teasing throwing his shirt into the crowd before Sting hit a few chops, his Scorpion Death Drop, and pinned Jeff Hardy despite Jeff's attempts to kick out. Sting, visibly upset at just what went down, responded to the crowd chanting bullshit. I agree. Hardy was sent home and all creative plans for him leading into lockdown were given to Bully Ray. During this time, Hardy was facing criminal charges of drug trafficking. Despite this, TNA made him the world champion. He was always planned to lose the title at Victory Road because his court case, where he was likely to face jail time, was just a few days later and the company didn't want their world champion going to prison. Hardy was found guilty in September 2011 and served 10 days in jail in October. During that time, he returned to TNA and became one of the company's top babyfaces again. The Monday Night Slaughter and Victory Road 2011 will, sadly, be what the Hogan-Bischoff era of TNA will be remembered for. Hogan turned babyface at Bound for Glory 2011 following his final televised match, and the company ran a new Invasion storyline with heel group Aces and Eights. But in the real world, Panda Energy removed its stake in TNA and Dixie Carter became the major shareholder, and the financial realities of Bischoff and Hogan's business plan came to the forefront. TNA spent a lot of money during the Hogan and Bischoff era, way more than they had in the past. Certainly on talent contracts for the big names like Angle, Sting, Flair, Hogan, RVD, Hardy, and Anderson, but Bischoff also convinced Dixie Carter that TNA needed to take Impact on the road rather than take the show in Orlando. This came at an increased expense but saw no financial return. TV ratings stayed the same, pay-per-view buy rates didn't move, and the live attendance didn't always offset the cost. Payment delays to talent and crew became commonplace, and some wrestlers were making so little money working for TNA that they had to take on second jobs. Taylor Wilde was spotted by a fan working at a sunglasses hut. She was the TNA Knockouts champion at the time. It then came out that TNA wrestler Jesse Neal was earning so little that he qualified for food stamps. Larry Zbyszko, who worked for TNA during the glory years, said in a 2013 interview that he believed half the roster were eligible for food stamps. Hogan's tenure with TNA came to an end in October 2013, and in the most Hogan exit possible, he quit the company on TV as Dixie Carter begged for him to stay. Literally on her knees, holding Hogan's leg, pleading with him not to leave TNA. Eric Bischoff was sent home by TNA to sit out the remainder of his contract, which expired in early 2014. In interviews since, Bischoff has very few positive things to say about TNA, even suing them for unpaid salary. In 2019, he said his time in TNA was regrettable. TNA's money issues continued as Dixie Carter tried various ways to earn money. They shot a pilot for a show called TNA All Wheels Wrestling as a way to appeal to NASCAR fans by doing a motor racing show that was also a wrestling show. New creative heads would come in. Russo would be replaced by Bruce Pritchard, who would be replaced by John Geberg, who would be replaced by Jeremy Borash. With each new writer came a new creative direction, all of which clashed with Dixie Carter's own ideas. As Dave Bradshaw wrote in the Wrestle Talk magazine, this revolving door of creative voices made it difficult for TNA to establish a cohesive identity, frustrating both fans and wrestlers who struggled to keep up with the constant shifts in storylines and character arcs. These money issues meant it was hard to negotiate contracts with their top stars. AJ Styles, a day one guy in TNA and arguably their most popular homegrown star, was offered a 60% pay decrease in 2014. He would tell Sports Illustrated, "There comes a time when loyalty has to be a two-way street. It was hard to leave, but the constant issues with pay and lack of direction made it clear TNA wasn't the same company I helped build." In true TNA fashion, AJ Styles in his final match with World Champion Magnus was made to look like a conquering hero and only lost due to lots of interference. Sting also left in 2014 and, in true TNA fashion, in his final match against World Champion Magnus was made to look like a conquering hero, only losing due to lots of interference. He also got 2 visual pins on the World Champion. Chris Sabin, Team 3D, Christopher Daniels, Frankie Kazarian, Samoa Joe, Taz, Hernandez, and more would all leave around this time. Those who helped shape the glory years were now gone. In an effort to save money, TNA stopped doing monthly live pay-per-views, instead pre-taping one-night-only specials that would air on pay-per-view for the majority of the year. Prestige shows like Bound for Glory, Lockdown, and Slammiversary would remain as live pay-per-views. Along with country music star Toby Keith, Jeff Jarrett attempted to buy TNA back from the Carters. He met with Bob Carter, who agreed to Jarrett's terms, but would only sell the company if Dixie Carter could remain an on-screen character. Jarrett and Keith did not agree to this, and the deal fell through. They instead launched Global Force Wrestling in 2014. More on that in a bit. But the biggest blow for TNA came in July 2014, when it was reported that Spike TV would not be re-signing TNA to air Impact. Although TNA denied these reports, they proved to be true when TNA left the station in November. And, hilariously, some of this blame can be put at the feet of Vince Russo. Much like TNA fans, Spike TV were not big on Vince Russo's style of booking and storytelling, so much so that they kind of requested that Russo not be involved in the product anymore, which TNA obliged. And it wasn't just Spike, as Wrestle One, who were doing business with TNA, did not want Russo there due to how he'd booked Japanese and Mexican talent in the past, most notably taking Kazuchika Okada and making him Bruce Lee from the Green Hornet and calling him Okato. Though TNA told Wrestle One that Russo hadn't been there since he mutually parted ways with the company in 2012, it wasn't technically true. Even after Russo left, fans would say online that they could feel his fingerprints on the creative, and it turns out that was because he was still working with TNA, only this time it was a secret. John Gaburik had to admit to Wrestle One's Keiji Muto that Russo was working with TNA, but only in a consulting role. However, Russo's creative involvement became public knowledge when Vince Russo emailed his ideas for that week's TV, and instead of sending that email to commentator Mike Tenay, he sent them to Mike Johnson of PW Insider. So Mike Johnson of PW Insider reported that Vince Russo was still with TNA. Oops. In fairness, while this is a very funny story, not all of the blame of Spike and TNA splitting can be blamed on Russo and the email to Mike Johnson. Johnson himself reported the relationship fell apart because TNA wanted more money from their Spike negotiations. Carter was looking for around $26 million for the deal, while Spike was looking more in the range of 14 to 16 million. Carter held strong on her position, and Spike pulled out of the deal. Realizing that she was now going to lose her multi-million-dollar deal, Carter tried to renegotiate, but it was too late, and Spike ended their partnership with TNA Wrestling. Mike Johnson wrote, "The reality is that, and I hate to defend Russo since he has out and out lied about me in the past, Russo had no bearing on Spike dropping the company. It all had to do with TNA's negotiations, nothing more. I'd love to point the finger at Russo but he had no bearing on whether the series remained at Spike or not, and that's the truth. The blame falls at Dixie Carter's handling of the situation based on multiple sources I've spoken to over the years. Anything else was immaterial. TNA ended up on Destination America, quite the downgrade from Spike as it was available in much less homes and was also a less lucrative deal, which only furthered the company's financial problems. Bobby Roode would say of the move, "We felt like we were taking a step back. Destination America was an opportunity, but we knew it wasn't a solution." Though TNA raised the average viewership of that station across the year on the channel, Destination America decided not to renew with TNA, and in 2015 they moved to Pop TV, a channel that again had little reach and was only really known for classic TV reruns and had no background in promoting live sports. With less eyeballs on TNA, Impact began to draw lower and lower ratings, which made it hard for them to keep hold of the fans they had, let alone gain new ones. It also meant it was hard for them to get sponsorship deals, which only hurt the financial strains of the company. James Storm once said it became exhausting. Every year there was a new network, a new set of rules, a new set of expectations. Despite gaining some interest from social media thanks to the rise of Broken Matt Hardy, the reality was that TNA's flagship pay-per-view of 2016, Bound for Glory, was on the brink of cancellation, until one man stepped in to save it.
Billy Corgan, Smashing Pumpkins.
Homer Simpson, smiling politely.
Billy Corgan, best known for being the frontman of the Smashing Pumpkins, had joined TNA in 2015 as the new head of creative and talent development, and by July 2016, it was reported that he had a minority stake in the company. He facilitated a loan to Dixie Carter to keep operations going, which is how Bound for Glory 2016 took place. Prior to that loan, talent were being told that their flights were cancelled and it looked like the company was about to go completely under. It was reported that WWE wanted to bring back Matt and Jeff Hardy and bring with them their broken universe, and Impact World Champion Bobby Lashley was speaking publicly about a WWE return for a dream match against Brock Lesnar. The reports were that WWE was just waiting to see if TNA would survive. During this time, long-standing roster members like Bobby Roode, Eric Young, and Velvet Sky left TNA. Corgan took over president of TNA in August 2016. In November 2016, Billy Corgan stepped down as president of TNA. You see, Corgan was not the only investor in TNA, as Tennessee-based Aerolux Marketing bought a stake in the company, and Anthem Sports, who also became the new broadcast partner for TNA in Canada, also got a stake in TNA. Corgan, who felt that his funding of TNA was going some way to him purchasing the company outright, took all parties to court, alleging that Dixie Carter had misled him about the company's financial state. Corgan's claim was that Carter promised him control of TNA if they ever defaulted on their loans, and argued in his court case that TNA was in such dire financial straits that the company was functionally insolvent. In the end, the judge sided with TNA as Corgan could not meet the legal requirements needed to take full control of TNA. And in the end, Anthem paid Corgan back the money he loaned Dixie Carter, thus becoming the company's largest shareholder. Dixie Carter resigned as chairwoman of TNA. It also meant that TNA needed a new leader, and who better than Bree Woo. Anthem's first move when it fully took over at TNA in 2017 was to bring back Jeff Jarrett as the company's executive producer and head of creative. He had briefly rejoined TNA in 2015 in a storyline where his new promotion, GFW, went to war with TNA, and when Jarrett returned in a backstage capacity, it was announced that GFW would merge with TNA and all belts were unified at Slammiversary 2017. Jeff Jarrett became the executive producer and head of creative in January 2017. In September 2017, Jeff Jarrett left TNA. Hilariously, in all of this, Impact did technically die, as Global Force Wrestling became the branding for the company for the few months that Jarrett was there, going back to Impact Wrestling when Jeff severed ties. Jarrett and Impact would remain in conflict for several more years, suing and countersuing until all was resolved in 2021. But back in 2017, Impact Wrestling needed new leadership. Again. Impact was now at its lowest point. It even lost its TV deal in the UK, which was disastrous for two reasons. Number 1, it was actually worth quite a bit of money for TNA, but more importantly, number 2, TNA retained the popularity it had from the glory days here on British shores. Whenever Impact ventured to the UK, it would always sell out tours. Without the TV deal, that all came to an end. In all of this, they also lost more talent like Drew Galloway, Matt and Jeff Hardy, Mike Bennett, and Maria Kanellis, all of whom signed to WWE over the next few years. Impact's latest new leadership came in the form of Scott D'Amore and Don Callis, who brought in a bunch of new names like Sami Callihan, Brian Cage, Pentagon Jr., and Rey Fenix, as well as the returns of former world champion Austin Aries. They went back to the grassroots idea of TNA and established relationships with Noah, AAA, New Japan Pro Wrestling, and World of Sport in the UK, which allowed them to bring in international talent without having to sign them to big contracts. This kept costs down while also providing lots of fresh matchups. In 2018, they signed a deal with Twitch to air big shows such as Impact Wrestling vs Lucha Underground. They even broke barriers by making Tessa Blanchard the Impact World Champion. In 2019, after 3 years on Pop, Impact moved to the Pursuit channel, known mostly for hunting and fishing shows, but it was at least a home that D'Amore and Callis could use to rebuild a fan base. It wasn't on there for very long, however, as Anthem purchased Access TV, which gave TNA perhaps its most stable home of programming since Spike. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Impact taped all their shows behind closed doors and fired Tessa Blanchard while she was still the world champion. Fightful Select reported that Impact had asked Blanchard to send in some promo videos, which she did not do, and so they fired her. They continued on during the pandemic and in December 2020 entered into a partnership with All Elite Wrestling, and the appearances of Kenny Omega on their TV shows and pay-per-views gave Impact their best viewership and buy rate numbers in years. Impact Wrestling's Rebellion, which featured Omega vs Rich Swann for both the Impact and AEW World Championships, did nearly 10 times better than Bound for Glory 2020. D'Amore would later tell Fightful that the two pay-per-views Omega featured on were two of the highest grossing shows in Impact's history. Omega won the Impact World Championship and even defended it on AEW programming before losing it to Christian Cage, returning to Impact for the first time since 2008. The partnership came to a quiet end. D'Amore told Fightful that while Omega wanted to do more work with Impact, there were constraints on him being used, which fractured the relationship between the parties. In October 2023, at the end of Bound for Glory, Impact Wrestling announced they would rebrand itself back to TNA, and their first pay-per-view back under that name, Hard to Kill 2024, did fantastic numbers. Reportedly, around 60,000 buys, their best since Genesis 2006. At WWE's 2024 Royal Rumble, TNA Knockouts champion Jordynne Grace blew down the forbidden door and sparked a partnership between the two companies, which has seen several NXT talent appear on TV and pay-per-view. And while those pay-per-view buy rates have not reached the heights that Hard to Kill did, Bound for Glory 2024 did around 5,000 buys, the company feels like its stock is higher than ever before thanks to the WWE partnership. For example, the attendance for Bound for Glory 2024 was the biggest the company has had in 11 years, which is why it was a surprise to many that following the success of Hard to Kill, Anthem revealed they had parted ways with Scott D'Amore, who had been credited for much of TNA's success since he took over. There were reports that D'Amore had tried to buy TNA outright, but Anthem turned down his offer and he was replaced by Anthony Sassone. And, well, at the time of this recording brings us up to date where TNA currently is. So, who really killed TNA? Or, at the very least, who is the reason that TNA spent over 10 years getting back to a state where it can be comfortably called the third biggest promotion in the United States? The most obvious answer is Vince Russo, a man who seemingly learned nothing from his failures and then kept repeating those same failures and somehow invented new ones. Despite the fans' protestations, Russo firmly believed he knew better and would not have his mind changed on the creative direction for TNA. I used the example earlier, but there is no better one than Kurt Angle's debut. He was in charge of creative when Kurt Angle jumped from WWE to TNA, and within 2 months made him just another guy on the roster. TV ratings remained the same, buy rates returned to normal. He was given star after star and made none of them feel special. He could book Kurt Angle versus Sting on TV or Shark Boy versus Curryman, and it would do the same rating. I didn't even get to talk about some of my other favorite Russo-rific TNA moments, like, did you know, despite pushing Samoa Joe as unbeaten for over a year, Christian Cage was also unbeaten in the same time period, and in that time somehow lost the NWA World Championship twice. Russo also booked a finish where, to crown the first ever TNA World Champion, Sting tapped out to Kurt's ankle lock while he was pinning Christian Cage, which meant the referee stopped counting the pin and declared Angle the winner, and that was then deemed too controversial by TNA management, so the belt was vacated. Yeah, they introduced a new belt, then immediately vacated it, but Russo was only put into that position because of Jeff Jarrett. He was told from day one by his father to not hire all the guys who ruined WCW, and Jarrett did just that and gave them big paydays. He sided with Vince Russo when all signs pointed to him being bad for the creative direction of the company. But bigger criminals in all of this are Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff, two men who came in and took a company that was making waves and pretty much destroyed it in just over a year. A remarkable decline in quality that is actually quite impressive. These two lads who took it to Vince McMahon in the late 90s could not organize a prayer in a church when they didn't have Ted Turner's unlimited resources behind them. Fans told them what they wanted to see, and they ignored them because they thought they knew better, and those fans tuned out in droves. The X Division that had seen such great success for TNA in the early years became a gimmick where all matches had to be contested in 3 ways. The Knockouts division that once outdrew the men became a background to push Brooke Hogan on TV. Bischoff and Hogan took a company that was already struggling financially and made them suffer further because of their bad business decisions, leading to a river of uncertainty until Anthem saved them from drowning. But through it all, until she wasn't, Dixie Carter was there. Perhaps the biggest reason TNA never succeeded to the point where it could have. Carter had no wrestling experience outside of being a fan, and instead of surrounding herself with people who knew what they were doing, chose to listen to Jeff Jarrett, Vince Russo, Hulk Hogan, and Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins. She is the reason they lost their Spike TV deal. She put aside $1 million in case Vince McMahon agreed to have his wrestlers appear on TNA for a shoot fight. She is the reason her talent had to work second jobs and survive on food stamps. A fish rots from the head down, and she was the head of Total Nonstop Action. As with every episode in this series, there is no definitive answer to the question, only the story of how it happened. So who do you think killed TNA? Why don't you let me know in the comments down below? I can tell you this for certain, it wasn't Scott D'Amore.